We communicate nearly every waking moment of our lives. And with that amount of practice, you'd think we'd be pretty good at it in the workplace. But if you're awake at your job for even half the day, you've probably noticed that most of your coworkers are not great communicators. And that's because they've never learned what good communication is, why it's so important, or how to apply it to their everyday work. And it doesn't matter how smart you are or how many hours you put in. If you want to be successful in your professional career, you need to be an effective communicator. It all starts with understanding what effective communication is in the first place. So with that, let's get started. Communication is effective when it's concise, intelligible, useful, and respectful. We'll briefly walk through those attributes one at a time and then discuss some tips you can use to communicate effectively at work. Each video in this course is only a few minutes because your time is valuable, and our attention spans aren't exactly long. Communicating in the workplace is no different. Whomever it is you're talking or writing to has a lot of other things on their plate. Think about it. If you have 8 things to get done today, how much time do you want to spend on a message that may not even be relevant to one of those tasks? A few minutes? Or like a few seconds? Even if that message is relevant to something on your to-do list, the last thing you have time for is reading someone else's 2-page office manifesto. So, any communication that's going to work needs to be as brief as possible and to the point. Getting there can be really difficult, especially when you're trying to convey complex information. People need to easily understand what you're writing or saying. There's no need to speak in terminology only you and a few others are familiar with, or use overly sophisticated language to show how smart you are. Doing so will irritate nearly anyone you work with. And that may sound obvious, but it's an easy trap to fall into, especially when you're trying to make a good impression with others. However, big words don't impress. Coherent, well-structured sentences do. Before you hit the send button or start speaking, ask yourself if a 12-year-old will understand you. If you're not sure, you need to start over and try again. And if someone sends a message asking you for a quick response, take a few moments to collect your thoughts. If you rush yourself, it's easy to write something incoherent or even opposite of what you intended. And chances are you'll need to correct yourself or retract what you wrote. It's happened to everyone, and it's really embarrassing, especially since it's so easy to avoid. Any communication in the workplace should add to what your coworkers and managers already know. And that information needs to either help them do their job or make a decision. You don't want people to wonder what they're supposed to do with the information you just provided to them. Let's say you're collecting data on consumer behavior. It may be interesting that you've teamed up with 2 of the brightest minds in the office to work on the project for 3 weeks, and that you found a new software application to help collect and parse the data. But your manager is just looking for the data. If she wants to know how you collected it, believe me, she'll ask. This concept may not always spring to mind when you're drafting an email or figuring out how to distill a month's worth of research into a 5-bullet point message. But that's the problem. Too many people don't think enough about being respectful to others when they're communicating. This is where emotional intelligence comes into play, which is simply considering what others will think or feel when they're reading what you wrote or listening to what you're saying. Imagine if your manager asks you publicly why there hasn't been a change to the company's marketing strategy after you've had 3 months to study consumer data. How would you feel after that? Embarrassed, insulted, angry, all of the above? A message can be concise, intelligible, and useful, but if the message publicly humiliates someone, it's definitely not effective, at least not in a positive way. You should always consider the tone and setting of your communication and its impacts on other people before blurting it out or sending a message. The better way to communicate that manager's message would have been to acknowledge the time and effort you've put into the project and see how you can start putting your findings to good use. By changing the tone of the message, softening it, altering expectations, and addressing the person's contributions, you can still light a fire under a person's butt to get things moving without embarrassing him or making yourself look like a grade A jerk in the process. If your communications are concise, intelligible, useful, and respectful, you will be recognized as a contributor to your company, which helps set you up for success in your professional career. And just as important, people will want to interact with you, which makes your work life not just tolerable, but even enjoyable and gratifying. We talked previously about what constitutes effective communication in general, regardless of whether you're speaking or writing. Any effective communication needs to be concise, intelligible, useful, and respectful. Sounds easy, right? Well, it's not. And it's even more difficult when you're communicating in writing because people perceive written messages differently. How many times have you sent a friend or family member an email or text only for them to completely misinterpret your message in a way you never intended? Unfortunately, your intentions don't matter when you're writing a message to a coworker or sending an email to a client. They can't read your mind, only your words. You want to make sure those words are prepared thoughtfully, and like any goal, you'll get there faster with a strategy. Here are 5 ways to make your workplace writing effective. If you had the choice of listening to a 30-minute lecture of me teaching just one section in this course, or a version that's under 5 minutes and essentially hits the same points, which one would you choose to listen to? The answer is obvious. You want those extra 25 minutes because you have other things to do with your life. The same point applies in the business world. Most people you work with are busy and have their own pile of things to get through, so you want to keep your messages brief and to the point. And that might be easy to do when someone asks you what time a meeting starts or what the agenda is. It's a lot more difficult if your manager wants a status update after you just finished a contract negotiation call that covered complex topics like pricing proposals, marketing reviews, and regulatory requirements. In that case, your response needs to be a sort of meaningful Cliff Notes version of your call. Anytime you find yourself in a situation where you need to summarize a ton of information, especially for your manager, start writing a first draft and put everything in it. Then start removing any points or details that aren't absolutely necessary for your manager to know about. For example, let's say you and a client have a tentative agreement on how to review and approve marketing copy for a new product you're launching together. That review covers things like identifying who's responsible for creating a first draft, how long the other side has to review and comment on it, and which side decides the final version. Kind of sounds like a sleep-inducing tennis match at the office. So how do you explain that process to your manager? You might be inclined to outline the approval process from beginning to end. But does that save her any time? I highly doubt she needs or wants to know those details. The better approach is to tell her that you and the client agreed to a marketing review process, timelines are built in, and there's a mechanism for approvals. If your manager wants more detail, she'll ask for it. Think about it. That's just one of several topics you need to include in your update, so you can see why you want to cut to the chase on each one. When you summarize a large amount of information in a relatively short but meaningful way, it not only shows that you're being thoughtful, it also tells the person you're writing to that you value their time. That'll get recognized, and you'll be appreciated for it. Organizing part or even most of a message into a bullet point format is one of the most effective tactics you should use when writing at work, especially when you're trying to package a bunch of information in a single message. There are 2 reasons for that. First, bullet points are generally easier to read than hacking your way through paragraphs because you're visually separating the topics you're hitting on. They're also easier for the reader to digest and find what they're looking for when reading the message again at a later time. Hunting through a forest of text for a single point is work nobody wants to do. Second, writing your message in bullet point form forces you to organize your thoughts. When you're describing a meeting, providing a status update on a project, or sharing next steps on a product redesign, it's easy to get sucked into writing a stream of consciousness. And next thing you know, you produced a short story that your 6th grade teacher would be proud of. But this is business and your career, not story time. Here's an example of a message in paragraph form, followed by an illustration of how it can be changed into bullet point form. Hey, Courtney, here's where we stand with the contract. The deal team met with the client yesterday to run through the outstanding items list. As predicted, their lawyers pushed back on every one of our proposals. Luckily, the client's business lead pushed them aside, met us halfway on the minimum fee requirements, and agreed to a 3-year deal instead of a 2-year deal. I'm good with the result, but want to confirm with Sarah and her team before we move to signatures. I'll keep you posted. Thanks. Now here's a more effective way to convey the information Courtney needs. Hey Courtney, here's where we stand with the contract. We met with the deal team yesterday to review the outstanding items list. The client met us halfway on the minimum fee requirement. We got agreement on a 3-year term. If Sarah's good with that, we'll circulate the contracts for signatures by Friday. I'll keep you posted. Thanks. You can see that with the bullet point version, we could separate each main point so it's easier to read. And let's say later in the day, Courtney forgot what the deal term was. Or maybe she was really thinking of what to eat for lunch while she was reading your message. It's a lot easier for her to find what she's looking for in a few bullet points compared to digging through a paragraph. Bullet points aren't ideal for every written communication, but they're a great tool to use anytime you need to distill a lot of information for someone, regardless of how complex the topic is. Let's say your coworker wrote a message addressed to you in a public forum, like a group messaging channel, accusing you of sidelining him on a deal and undercutting his authority in the process. You might be tempted to write a response like this. Please don't accuse me of sidelining you on this deal. You're the one who skipped yesterday's meeting, so I had to step in and lead. Try taking your job more seriously next time. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Makes you feel better, right? It lets other people know not to mess with you. Unfortunately, sending an emotionally charged message like that in a business setting is not a good idea. I'd put it up there with texting while driving. Eventually, it's not going to end well. But someone at some point is going to level an accusation at you or make a snide comment, and if you're like most people, you're going to have the natural feeling to want to defend yourself. Even more so if those comments are made in public. And you should defend yourself. But if that accusation or comment is made in writing, do not send a response right away. Step away from your computer. Take a walk and think about the situation for a while. If you don't need to send a response that day, sleep on it and wait until the morning to draft it. Either way, you should let off some steam before sitting back down, writing a draft, reviewing it, and rewriting it only with logic and a positive tone. After doing that, instead of writing a feel-good message telling Jamie to get lost, you should write a more level-headed response, like this. I'm sorry you feel that way, but the last thing I'm trying to do is sideline anyone. When you notified the team before the call that you couldn't join and the client wouldn't reschedule at the last minute, I stepped in to answer their questions in line with what you and I previously discussed. The call went well, and I'm happy to catch you up in person. A message like that accomplishes a couple things. First, you're defending yourself and your reputation against your coworker's accusation by pointing out there's a good reason why you continued the meeting without him. The client essentially insisted on it. Second, you're showing anyone witnessing the exchange that you can keep calm under pressure, when really all you did was step away from the conversation, take a deep breath, and use some time to formulate a response with a respectful tone. You're effectively turning what would otherwise be a dramatic situation into one that showcases your talents. It's certainly not easy or immediately satisfying to hold back what you're feeling when you're on the receiving end of a rude or accusational comment. But it's hard to overstate the importance of taking a more level-headed approach in your response because you're more likely to avoid saying something you'll regret. And it projects an image of professionalism and maturity, which is something you can only benefit from. The purpose of communicating in a work environment is to transfer useful information that can easily be understood and acted on. There's nothing more annoying than reading a message that's convoluted or riddled with words the average person needs a dictionary to understand. Sophisticated thinking, planning, and communicating does not require you to use elaborate language. Throughout your career, you'll likely receive hundreds of messages that sound something like this. Hey Tim, I found the client's approach to be outside industry norms and based on an unfounded perception that our service commands a lower rate of cost in subsequent years. They wouldn't even provide data to justify their position. I'd recommend surfacing a counteroffer aligned with recent industry trends, which is included in a report I've tailored for external circulation. Pretty obnoxious, isn't it? Here's a translation of that corporate fluff into something a normal person can understand. Hey Tim, the client seems to have an unrealistic view of our service's value. I'm not sure where that's coming from, but I'd recommend we share some industry stats with them that show we're in the same ballpark as our competitors. I'll have a report you can provide to them soon. Those two paragraphs are getting at the same point. The client seems to be misinformed, and we can show them the data to prove it. But the second version manages to communicate the point in a manner that remains tactful, and it's much easier to understand. Here are a few tips to make sure you're writing in simple, plain language. First, there's no need to advertise how smart you are, so don't write like the 1%. Use words that 99% of the population understands. Next, avoid using technical terms or acronyms that are specific to your trade but won't likely be understood by the person you're communicating with. Many of the people you interact with on a regular basis won't have your expertise because we're working more cross-functionally now than ever. If you absolutely need to use a specific technical term because there's no suitable substitute for it, that's fine. But if others included in the conversation aren't familiar with that technical term, be sure to briefly explain what it means so that all your coworkers will understand. And lastly, make sure you're writing as concisely as possible. If you use run-on sentences, you'll likely lose the attention of the person you're writing to. Keeping your writing simple can sometimes feel counterintuitive. You might be worried you won't come across as intelligent. The truth is that simple isn't easy, but a straightforward, understandable message isn't just effective, it's elegant, and it'll reflect well on you. During your professional career, you're bound to receive your fair share of messages that sound something like this. Jane, I prepared a presentation for the content refinement project and need your feedback by Friday. We can discuss in advance during our weekly meeting. Mark. Does that message give you a positive impulse or a negative one? Do you feel like telling Mark to take a hike? I would. Are you looking forward to reviewing that presentation? Probably not. That request to provide feedback is more of a demand, and it's kind of condescending. Like, just read the presentation and don't irritate me with questions. There's no need for that kind of tone, and it's obviously not a positive or constructive communication. Now let's say Mark wrote the following instead. Hi Jane, I'd like to get your feedback on the content refinement project when you have a chance. We have a Friday deadline for publication, so if it's possible to hear from you by then, I'd appreciate it. Happy to discuss in more detail during our next weekly meeting. Thanks. Night and day difference, right? You probably want to work with the second version of Mark rather than the first. The request is the same, but if you had to deal with someone who writes with a curt or snippy tone, my guess is that at some point you'd be tempted to respond in kind, or you'd figure out a way to not work with Mark. Neither of those outcomes works well for anyone. You'll go further being pleasant with people, which by definition means asking politely or even instructing someone politely and thanking them when you do. And as difficult as it may sound, try your best to take the same approach with people who aren't always polite in return. You'll be the adults in the room, and they'll end up looking foolish. It's easy to see why you want to strike a respectful tone with your manager, or really anyone who's more senior than you at your company. Doing the opposite will put you on the express lane to unemployment city. But this concept is just as applicable when you're a manager communicating with someone on your team. Throughout your career, you'll be on the receiving end of some pretty obnoxious communications from some of your managers. When that happens, you'll naturally get a bit ticked off. Thoughts of throwing water balloons at heads may or may not be involved. It can be a bit shocking when otherwise very smart people don't realize the obvious impact a condescending tone has on their team, which is to have less of a desire to work hard, not more. It literally has the opposite effect a manager intends. So when you're a manager, and if you're not now, you will be at some point in your career, try to use the same respectful tone when communicating with your team members as you would with your boss. Anyone worth having on your team will respond with a positive attitude and want to work hard because they know you respect and appreciate them. Email, messaging apps, and collaboration platforms have replaced a lot of the conversations that we used to have face-to-face. But none of these tools are as efficient or valuable as when people talk live with each other. It's why we use video calls so often, especially as remote work becomes more common. When you walk into a meeting or the video call begins, you need to be ready to present yourself well with your coworkers and managers. There are some basic rules you need to follow to make sure your spoken communication is as effective as your written communication. First, slow down. A lot of people have a tendency to speak too quickly, especially when they're nervous speaking in front of more than one person. The faster you talk, the more likely you're going to bypass that filter between your brain and your mouth and say something unintentional or regrettable. You'll also have to take an awkward long pause to catch your breath. Don't rush yourself. Just take your time and speak clearly. Second, find the right volume. This one is a bit of a balancing act, and it's a more common issue than you might think. If you speak too softly, not only will people be unable to hear you, it projects a lack of confidence and self-esteem. But you want to project confidence, which means you need to speak up. And that's fine, because if you prepared for whatever it is you're talking about, you have reason to be confident. On the other hand, if you speak too loudly, you sound obnoxious, and people will avoid you like the plague. The lesson here is simple. Speak confidently and just loud enough so people can actually hear and understand you. Third, focus on one person at a time. For most of us, speaking to a group of people can be an unnerving experience. But with remote work becoming more popular, one of the benefits of many video conferencing tools is that you can bring up a single person view, which sort of tricks your brain into thinking you're really just talking to the one person you can see rather than the rest of the group on the call. If you're speaking to a group in person, use that same tactic by focusing on one person at a time and start talking to them as if they're the only one in the room. After you get one sentence out of your mouth, move your attention to the next person and do the same thing. You'll eventually find yourself getting more comfortable with speaking to a larger audience because, to your brain, you're still just speaking to one person at a time. Finally, maintain a conversational inflection. The pitch of your voice impacts how others listen to you. If you drone on in a monotone or use oddly timed inflections, people will naturally lose interest in what you're saying, and you'll actually sound kind of immature. You'd be surprised how ubiquitous this mistake is, even for senior executives. I know of someone in a leadership position who presented to his entire company each week. People would cringe every time he'd speak because he'd end his sentences with a higher pitched tone to the point where it sounded like he was singing a melody. That bizarre karaoke-esque inflection draws away from what he says to how he says it. If you didn't know this person was incredibly smart and hardworking, you'd be scratching your head wondering how he got into a leadership position in the first place. There's no special meeting voice or presentation tone that you need to adopt when you're speaking. Just talk naturally, as if you were having a casual conversation with a friend, and you'll be fine. One of the main reasons why most people aren't great speakers at work is because they don't practice. Think about it. It's easy to go a full day, maybe several consecutive days, without speaking to a group of people on the phone or in a video conference because practically every communication is through a messaging app or email. It's up to you to create the opportunities to get that practice. If there's something that needs to be discussed or decisions that need to be made, schedule a call or an in-person meeting instead of typing away like a mad person. When it comes to speaking in front of others at work, practice may not always make perfect, but it'll make you more comfortable and confident when you communicate. So, start seizing the opportunities to speak publicly. It'll only get easier. I mentioned the phrase emotional intelligence at the beginning of this course, which some people also refer to as emotional IQ or just EQ. It's become a sort of catchphrase, but the underlying concept is anything but new. Emotional intelligence is simply your ability to be considerate and thoughtful in the way you talk to people. There isn't much focus on emotional intelligence in our education system or in the workplace, but that's a huge mistake. It's yet another incredibly important skill you should have that simply isn't taught in school. Being emotionally intelligent is critical to building trust with your coworkers, managers, clients, partners, really anyone you interact with. And that trust is fundamental in building productive relationships. It's those productive relationships combined with whatever subject matter expertise you build over time that helps set you up for success in your professional life. Developing emotional intelligence involves 3 basic steps. First, be aware of circumstances. You might be directing a message to someone in particular, but if you're sending it in a public forum or an email thread with 7 other people, you shouldn't speak with the same tone as if you were chatting one-on-one with that person. Anything you write that could imply a criticism in front of other people is going to embarrass that person or make them defensive, neither of which is a good thing. Timing is also important, and unfortunately, it's often ignored. Let's say you just participated in a team meeting where your coworker Jim was lambasted by the CEO, but you need some data from him to wrap up a project you're working on. Do you think Jim wants to hear from anyone right now? Probably not. He'd be ticked off if you reached out to him knowing you just witnessed what happened. It suggests you don't care about his personal situation. Give the guy some time to cool off before asking him for that data. Or see if you can get it from someone else. That's what emotional intelligence is, understanding there are right and wrong times to engage. Next, know who you're communicating with. Does she have a more quiet or introverted personality? Is she more sensitive than the average person? If the answer to either question is yes, you probably shouldn't be as direct in your messaging as you otherwise might be because that person is more likely to feel like she's being verbally attacked or scolded. On the other hand, if the person you're communicating with is more on the extroverted side, has a somewhat abrasive personality, or is known to have thick skin, that person is not likely to shrivel up and hide if you're being a little more direct with them. In fact, they may react more positively to direct communication. Lastly, adjust what you say for the other person's perspective. When you're aware of someone's personality traits and you understand the circumstances they're working in, then you're putting yourself in a position to make better judgments on the timing and substance of your communications. In other words, you're looking at your communication from the other person's point of view rather than just your own. That'll help you shape what you're writing or saying in a way that's more easily understood by the person you're communicating with, which will make your message more effective. You might not always be appreciated for having a high emotional IQ, but when you're conscious of how other people think and feel when they're processing what you're saying or writing, and you adjust your messaging based on that understanding, you're much more likely to build trust and create positive working relationships. Over the previous sections, we've learned what effective communication actually means, how to speak and write in the workplace, and why you should adjust your style to the unique personalities of those you work with. Together, these skills combine to form touch and tone, the most effective way to approach any situation and put these lessons into practice. The more you hone your touch and tone, the more you'll find yourself developing productive work relationships and positively influencing people around you. We're changing jobs and even professions more often than ever. That means you're probably going to experience the full spectrum of different work environments, coworkers, managers, and company cultures throughout your career. One thing I can say with certainty is, none of them will be perfect. In fact, at some point, you'll likely find yourself in a situation where your workaholic manager expects you to consistently put in the same 60 to 70 hours per week that he does. Now, you might be telling yourself that you'd simply find another job if that were the case. And sometimes that's the right thing to do, but not always. For example, if you're a few months into your role, you probably want to hang on a bit before jumping ship. It's a good idea to get at least 1 full year under your belt before moving on, assuming your workplace is bearable, because working in a job for less than a year tends to be a red flag to prospective employers. Or maybe, aside from your boss, you love your job and the people you work with, and the last thing you want to do is have to prove yourself all over again at another company. Either way, your situation needs to change, and that change starts with a conversation grounded in the proper touch and tone. The stakes are high in moments like these because your job could be on the line if your manager is apathetic to your situation, or, as with many companies, it's assumed that everybody works nearly every waking moment of their lives. In those cases, simply raising the issue to your manager that you're working too many hours is like ringing a cowbell at your company's all-hands meeting. You'll end up looking like the crazy one. You might be told that if you can't put in the work this job requires, then maybe you're not a good fit for the company. And while you may not be fired on the spot, you'll always be wondering if you're on the chopping block. And if you think your manager won't be able to relate to your concern, you should probably fight the temptation to go above him by talking with his boss. That's akin to pulling the fire alarm in the company break room and pointing to your manager. So in this situation, start planning the conversation by considering your manager's perspective. Most managers don't have the time or desire to know all the details of what you're working on at any given moment, or how long it takes you to get it done. They have their own work to do and their own manager to deal with. Understanding that dynamic is critical because it should eliminate the assumption that your manager doesn't care about your situation, which causes frustration and all sorts of negative emotions that are definitely not helpful. Also realize that your manager may not have your to-do list memorized or know the crazy number of hours you're putting in. Prepare to illustrate how and why your workload is simply too much for one person to get through and that it's become the norm rather than the exception. It's your responsibility to bring a solution to the problem prompting this conversation. A solution can take on many forms. For example, hiring a full or part-time person onto your team, automating time-consuming manual tasks, or more evenly distributing work across the team. Offering ideas like these demonstrates that you're being a collaborative partner in addressing the problem rather than placing the burden solely on your boss. Once you've developed your plan, be sure to have this conversation face-to-face, either in person or virtually. There's a time and place for communicating in writing through email, text, or using your company's messaging platform. But raising an issue as important as this with your manager for the first time lends itself to a live discussion. You should start the conversation by acknowledging the amount of work on everyone's plates, including his, but describe with specific examples that the volume of work you're responsible for has simply become unmanageable. Share the ideas that might help balance your workload, emphasizing the ones you think might work best. Be sure to acknowledge that you don't expect a resolution overnight. Your consideration and patience doesn't just demonstrate professionalism. It sets a non-accusatory tone, which might prevent your manager from reacting defensively. Finally, remember to keep everything you say as concise, logical, and straightforward as possible, always using a respectful tone. Let your boss know you appreciate their willingness to have this difficult conversation. Any reasonable manager is going to be sympathetic to people on the team being overworked. They realize that it inevitably leads to frustration and mental exhaustion, causing quality of work to suffer. That spells bad news not just for the company, but for your manager, because he's largely judged by the quality of his team's work. If your manager agrees to one of the solutions you proposed, or maybe he presents a better solution, express your willingness to work together toward the long-term success of your team and the company as a whole. Then, celebrate the second the doors close. You pulled off touch and tone in one of the world's most stressful workplace situations. You devised a plan based on an understanding of what effective communication is and considered your manager's point of view, which allowed you to adjust how and what you communicated. A parade in your honor should not be out of the question. But even with perfect touch and tone, success isn't guaranteed. If your manager isn't understanding and suggests you're the problem, then it probably does make sense to search for another job. Even if you haven't been at your position for a year, you now have a perfectly reasonable explanation to any prospective employer as to why you're looking elsewhere. What's more, the HR team and others you'd be speaking with at that prospective employer will be able to relate to your situation because they've likely been there themselves. Pulling off touch and tone can sound like following some intimidating mental and emotional instruction manual. In practice, it's much more simple. You just need to bring all of the skills in your communication toolbox to the office and let them complement each other as you work through a given situation. We can all communicate well. We're often just missing the knowledge and experience to do it. If you couple the strategies you've learned in this course with the mastery of your own chosen trade, there's no limit to what you can accomplish in your professional career. Thanks for watching. You can review this course at any time and check out our other courses at officeintelligence.com.